And now we're going to talk about Neuro Innovations, restoring, augmenting, and extending human capacity. And our next speaker is Dr. Karen Moxon. So Dr. Moxon is a professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering here at UC Davis. She has conducted groundbreaking research in neuroengineering, developing computational models to study the encoding of sensory and motor information. An important focus of her work is the impact of neural injury on the representation of information in the brain. Early in her career, she contributed to the first demonstration of a closed-loop, real-time brain-machine interface system in a rat model that was quickly translated to non-human primates and more recently to humans with neurological disorders. This work has spurred an entirely new discipline within neuroengineering, and it has had and will continue to have a global impact. So, Dr. Moxon, we're very excited to have this conversation with you. Thank you for doing this.
No, great. Thank you for setting this up and that kind introduction. And I feel like COVID is waning and it's springtime, and it's just wonderful to see you and to be able to be here and talk about things. So great. Nice to be here.
Terrific. So I want to start simple, but with something that might be confusing. So you are a neuroengineer.
Yes.
Before we get started, can you tell us what that means?
Sure. I think we all agree that in the entire universe, there is no more fascinating a system than the brain. On the one hand, we know so much, all of the things that Dr. DeCarli just went through, all of the things that neuroscience has brought us in the last, millennium. But at the same time, there's so much that we don't know. And why wouldn't engineers want to get in on that? I mean, it's just incredible. When you get introduced to the brain, you're just like, oh, I didn't know about that. That's what I want to be a part of. So if you think about the whole spectrum, labels are useful, and the label neuroengineering is useful, but I'm very broad about the topic, right? It can be, if you feel like you are a neuroengineer, then you're a neuroengineer. So, but think about the spectrum of neuroscience and neuroscience research. On one end, there's your traditional neuroscientist who might go into the lab and say, I have a hypothesis about how I think things work. I'm going to develop an experiment to test that hypothesis, and I'm going to take those data, and I'm going to interpret those data to try to understand something better about how the brain works. On the other hand, far end of the spectrum in neuroengineering, I'm an engineer. Engineers typically were problem solvers, right? I see a problem, I want to fix it. So spinal cord injury, tragic, tragic problem. How can we use our engineering know-how and solve that problem? So we would take everything that those neuroscientists bring to us, we would take everything that we know about physical systems that we learn from physics and math, and apply that and create a solution. But I would say that neuroengineers exist on that entire spectrum, right? You can use the techniques and technologies that we've developed in neuroengineering and create new kinds of experiments that no one had ever conceived of before because of all of these advances in technology, and all of a sudden, you can study the brain in ways you've never been able to study the brain before. So some people, background and training is neuroscience all the way. They have a biology undergraduate, they have a PhD in neuroscience, and they are clearly neuroengineers. Other people on the other spectrum, they have studied engineering the whole way through. They interact with and collaborate with neuroscientists and other important investigators, and they are neuroengineers. So I think as Dr. Carli said before, what's the advice to young people coming up? If you're passionate about it, go do it and embrace the label if it helps you, and don't worry about the label if it doesn't help you. So that's kind of how I feel about it.
Terrific. So in 2017, you published a paper highlighting a novel approach that allowed paralyzed rats to walk again, which is amazing. So can you explain the approach that you developed and what the implications are for this kind of intervention in humans?
Yeah, so again, I'm back to, the brain is just the most fascinating system in the world. And I was very attracted to that from the very beginning. And early in my career, I worked together with people who were very passionate about understanding spinal cord injury. And you could imagine that if you're going to study spinal cord injury, where are you going to put all of your effort and all of your focus? You're going to put it on the spinal cord. I want to repair the spinal cord. And that's important, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done there. But there's two other very important things to think about. One is that a spinal cord injury is also a brain injury to some extent. The neurons that live in your brain send axons all the way down your spinal cord, and then they synapse into the network in the spinal cord that sends signals out to your muscles on how you want to move. If you have a spinal cord injury, those axons are damaged, and they impact those cells that are living in your brain. So we can't forget about the fact that a spinal cord injury is going to have that kind of an impact on the brain. And then from another point of view, we all now appreciate clearly that the brain is plastic, right? There was an idea that, well, you go through a young age and we have all this plasticity and we learn of all of our things, then sometime after adolescence, it all goes away and we don't learn anything new and we just have this plateau for the rest of our lives. And we know for sure that that's not true anymore. The brain is extremely plastic. So if you have an injury like a spinal cord injury, your brain says, hey, I still want to move. I still want to get up and do things. How can I change? How can I have plasticity in my brain that's going to optimize my output? So that was sort of the insight into what we tried to do. And then we said, okay, how do we develop therapies that will engage the brain and induce that plasticity? So we did it with a combination of therapies. So two things sort of came out of this. One was that spinal cord injury, in order to optimize outcome, you have to consider the neural system along the entire neural axis. And that means from the brain all the way down to the nerves that go out to your muscles. And the second is that if you want to optimize your output, you have to bring together many technologies. So we brought together pharmacology and rehabilitation. And by combining all those together, we were able to get animals that had a complete spinal transection to get up and take weight-supported steps, which was the first time that had been demonstrated in that kind of a model. But I think more importantly, what we found was that now rats are different than people. So these experiments were done in rodents. And if you have a healthy rodent, and you go into his motor cortex and you lesion the motor cortex, they can still get up and they can still walk. They're perfectly fine. They have some minor motor deficits, but they don't really need their cortex to walk. It's not true for humans, but for rats this is true. If I take an animal that has a complete spinal transection and I provide therapy that allows the animal to get up and walk, and I go into that animal's motor cortex and I lesion that motor cortex, all of the gains and benefits that we have made are gone. So we know that post-spinal cord injury, those changes that we're seeing in the brain, especially those changes that are induced by therapy, are critically important for that functional outcome. And I think that's made a big impact in our understanding about what we need to do to really optimize performance in spinal cord injury.
It's incredible. So some of the work that you do really does seem straight out of a science fiction movie because it's so cutting edge and forward looking. And I know another area that you focus on in your lab is the brain-machine interface. So an acronym for this is BMI. We're not talking about the BMI that you hear about in the doctor's office, but the brain-machine interface. So can you explain what a BMI is and how it works and why it's important?
Sure. So if you think about what I was just saying in the sense of no single one therapy is probably going to improve function after spinal cord injury. We need to bring together multiple therapies. So we spent a lot of time with pharmacological therapies and combining them with physical rehabilitation, and we really only got so far. And being an engineer, we said, okay, what can engineering bring to the table? So if I can improve performance to a certain level, but my inability of my brain to communicate with regions below the level of the lesion, then maybe I could, like a little telephone line, jump around that lesion and take signals from the brain and have them control systems below the level of the injury. So brain-machine interface is this idea of putting electrodes into the brain and recording the activity of neurons and decoding what the intention is. So for many years, many of you know about EEG, right? Electroencephalography. You can put electrodes on the surface of your scalp and you can record those signals and you can understand several things about what's going on in the brain and see all kinds of different signals. But those signals are really far away from the source of the activity, and the information content is strongly degraded. So brain-machine interface comes along and says, to really get the information out of the brain, we have to stick electrodes into the brain. So we took large arrays of microelectrodes. What's important to understand here is that in order to be able to do that, we had to have huge technological advances. So let's say in the 60s, people could put in one electrode at a time and record from one neuron at a time. And you could say, okay, if I put that neuron into the sensory cortex for the hand and I tap you on your hand, then I can see that the neurons are changing their firing rate. So somehow that firing patterns of neurons is encoding the information about where you're contacted. If I put electrodes into the motor cortex and I ask you to move your arm, the pattern of a single neuron is going to change its firing rate depending upon how you move your arm. So we get this general idea that single neuron firing patterns are conveying information. And in around the 70s, people said, okay, I can't really record from many neurons at a single time, but I'll have the subject repeat the activity over and over again. And then I will just say, well, what happens if I pretended that I recorded a bunch of different neurons across all those different trials? And it looks like I can probably tell you what direction the subject moved their hand. So we knew that there was enough information in there on a single trial to tell you what you wanted to do. Now technology evolves. We get PCs on your desktop, and all of a sudden people now take stacks of personal computers, each one controlling a single microelectrode that's put into the brain, and now we can simultaneously record a whole bunch of neurons at once. And the reality is that in those patterns of neurons across many cells, we could, on a single trial, tell you what direction you moved your arm or what type of stimulus that you received. And that really kicked off, I think, what is the beginning of what we think of as brain-machine interfaces now. And in the 90s, they began to build dedicated systems for this. And I think that technology advancement was really critical. So now you have these single boards that can each record, let's say, 8 neurons at a time with all the filters and amplifiers, because you have to realize that those little neurons are producing microvolt-sized signals. And they are next to thousands of other neurons that are also producing microvolt-sized signals. So we need to amplify that and filter and actually know when a single neuron is firing an extra potential, and we need to do that for hundreds of neurons. And once you can get to that point, now it's becoming actually relatively easy. The information is there. We do a lot of machine learning algorithms and other types of computer science approaches to improve those decoders. And now we have humans controlling robotic arms to pick up objects, pour a glass of water, bring it to them, and drink. These are people who were paralyzed and not able to move for 10, 20 years. And we implant these little tiny pin-sized devices in their brain that record hundreds of neurons, take that signal out, decode it, use it to control the robot arm, and people can now feed themselves for the first time, give themselves a drink of water for the first time. And if you go to YouTube, there's a lot of videos out there showing patients who have been implanted and what it's like for them to use these types of systems. And you can see the joy in their eyes that they can finally start to take care of themselves a little better than they could before. It's quite moving.
Oh, it's remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. So given how quickly technology has been moving, where do you see this field going in 5, 10, 15 years? And how do you see that impacting clinical care?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and it is complicated. If you think about the neurotechnology industry today, excuse me, it's projected to be about a $15 billion industry in 2024. Twitter has a market cap of 36 billion. So what are we talking about here, right? And a lot of that has to do with, what does it mean to translate science and technological advances that you can do in the research lab to patients in the clinic. And it is just tremendously harder than you could imagine. And part of it is the resources, right? So where do we get the resources? If I show a demonstration, because the NIH and several other foundations and private philanthropy provided enough money to develop these technologies, and now there's maybe 20 patients implanted with these devices. It's several $1 million per patient to get this going. Now there's a long trajectory of how to make this affordable, how to improve the technology so that we can have high reliability and low, potential for something to go wrong. This is a big, they call it the valley of death, right? We do these great things in the lab and we say, boom, why shouldn't people be doing this? And if you look back through the history of neurotechnologies, it's kind of a sad story. We have developed devices that can stimulate your muscles and restore function in people's hands who have lost it due to some kind of injury. And people went off and spun off companies, and those companies got started, and they built devices, and they provided them to the community, and there was no way for the people to pay for those, and then for that enough money to come in to keep advancing those, and those companies fell by the wayside. What's the likelihood that these technologies will really start to take off and people will recognize the cost benefit, right? So if I'm a paralyzed person and I can't move, I'm a tremendous cost on society. My brain is working pretty well if I have spinal cord injury, but I'm not able to contribute to society because I'm locked in at home and I need 4 or 5 caretakers. So we know the cost benefit analysis is there. That's crystal clear. But it's always that first hurdle to get over to get the technologies cheap enough, not so expensive so that we can have more and more people using it, and then that just creates a sort of a snowball effect where we can then create more technologies. So if I had a crystal ball, I would love to say that this is just going to continue to accelerate like you see accelerations in other forms of technology, right? They're not a linear increase, they're an exponential increase. And I think neuroengineering is starting to hit its paces where we will start to see that kind of exponential increase in the years to come.
I hope so. I really hope so. It's so exciting. So are there any concerns about the misuse of BMIs or unintended consequences?
Sure. I mean, if you think about, so who wants to get into this space, right? I don't know, many of you may know, Elon Musk's got a company called Neuralink, where he would like to implant electrodes into your brain and have you plug into the computer every day, even if you're perfectly healthy. Nissan and a couple of other car companies have programs to record your EEG signals because they're concerned about you falling asleep behind the wheel of the car. And their point is, if you fell asleep behind the wheel of the car, I could record your EEG signals and alert you if you're about to fall asleep. But what are the unintended consequences of this sort of thing? And if you just think about Facebook for a second, what happened when you could just click on a like symbol, a thumbs up or a thumbs down? The massive amount of information that they could get about you personally and use to, I would call it manipulate you with advertising to make you buy things you don't want or you don't need. It's amazing, just those little clicks. Now consider the fact that your neural signals are being recorded 24/7 or maybe 8 hours a day. This data is going to some database somewhere, and now they're really profiling you. So I think that's one of the greatest concerns is what happens to all this data and what are we talking about with privacy? What does it mean to own your own data and who gets access to it? And if I want to, it seems as though advertising is the thing that drives everything moving forward. If we're going to rely on advertising to move forward the neurotechnology space, we could be in trouble because who's getting control of the data then, right? So I think those are all things that we need to think about and be concerned about. And then there's another side, which is agency. If I am using my neural signals through some sort of decoder, that decoder is not passive, right? It's passive, but how you design that decoder can change what the outcome might be for a certain set of neural signals that you put into it, right? So you have to have a sense of agency. We all consider ourselves, when I want to move and pick something up, I am doing that. Now you're taking your neural signals out and you're moving a robotic arm. What if that robotic arm is not doing exactly what you intended, but it's okay? How much agency have you lost, and how much does that agency influence you as a person? We have examples from Parkinson's disease, for example. You may or may not know, you sort of start out with a drug regime with Parkinson's disease, but eventually most people will have a Parkinson's stimulator chronically implanted into their brain, and it will constantly stimulate. And there are plenty of examples where that Parkinson's stimulator has changed people's personality. Why this happens, we don't exactly know. But then what does this mean in terms of agency, right? So if it tends to make you much more gregarious, so outgoing that now you become a risk seeker, and you take your family fortune and you spend it all, and your family comes in and says, turn off this stimulator, it's changing our loved one, and they are not behaving in a way that we like, and that person says, I feel great, I don't want you turning off my stimulator. What is the right thing here? These are very complicated, deep questions that need a lot of thought, and I'm sorry, I don't have any answers to them, but the level of misuse is huge, so I think we need to have really long, deep, strong conversations about that.
So it sounds like to be able to move this forward in an ethical way, that you need ethicists on these teams, as well as neuroscientists and engineers. You also need industry involved. You need a lot of different players. And I know that you've been visionary in trying to bring together all of these different types of faculty members and trainees in a new center that you've established here, the Center for Neuroengineering in Medicine. So can you tell us a little bit about that and what your vision is for the center?
Yeah, so this is very exciting. So Kim, in the beginning, you put up the Neuroscience Consortium. So if you go to that Neuroscience Consortium site and you look at the centers that's a portal to open to, one is the Center for Neuroengineering in Medicine. And I have to give, a shout out to Professor Sanjay Joshi in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, who was the original sort of driving force behind it, and his efforts actually helped recruit me here, and I will be forever in his debt for that. And it took a few years after I got here and a few other people, we sort of created a triumvirate. So Sanjay, myself, and Carolyn Patent, because it's a lot of work, and neuroengineering is extremely broad. So Carolyn Patent is a professor in the School of Medicine, and she's very interested in translational research, especially as it relates to improving clinical practice. And together, we created the center. We got support from the Office of Research, thank you very much for that, and the College of Engineering, which we couldn't have functioned without it. And we were able to bring in Gabriella Lee, who's sitting here in the audience today, who has experience running centers at UC Davis in the past, and she's our associate director. And together, we've been able to launch the center, which was very important because it gave us space for everybody to come together. And you're exactly correct in this idea that it's not just these people called neuroengineers. Some of us are core sort of neuroengineers, but we do have ethicists, we do have regulatory people, we do have people in the legal department, we have people who are basic fundamental neuroscientists who are interested in collaborating with us. We have people who are mechanical engineers, people who are electrical engineers, and they would definitely consider themselves electrical engineers, not neuroengineers, and they contributed. So it's a highly interdisciplinary program. We have members from all of the colleges on campus, and work, collaboratively with, of course, the National Primate Research Center here at UC Davis, the Vet School, School of Medicine, as I said before, and being able to bring all these diverse people together and for them to have a place where ideas can be exchanged. And I think that's the most important thing, and a place where you can go and look and say, I need a collaborator on this project. Where can I go to get that collaborator? And one of the things that's exciting is, so we have 4 research thrust areas. One is sort of neurotechnology and neurocomputation. One is human-machine interfaces, and you could imagine these are very important in high-risk environments. So astronauts who go out in space, or firefighters, how do you develop machines so that when you're in these high-risk environments, those machines are working closely and interacting well with the user? And then, of course, we have neurorehabilitation. And the final one is what is new. It's brand new concept. And UC Davis is the first sort of to put it forward, and it's something I'm very passionate about, is cognitive neuroengineering. So, Dr. DeCarli has been speaking about Alzheimer's disease, but there's many other neuropsychiatric disorders that could benefit from neurotechnologies. So, for example, depression scales, we know that if you do some neuromodulation, you can improve outcomes from depression. Well, what if you could record your neural state, and as you begin to move to a depressive state, we could do a little bit of neuromodulation and just push you out of that state and push you back into a more, normal range of states. Or vice versa, you're a high-risk gambler, and we want to, you want to get out of that, and drugs have side effects, and sometimes drugs aren't always the right way to go. So you implant a stimulating device, and when you see yourself, or when the system picks up that you're moving into a space that is inappropriate or beyond what you would like to be, you could sort of stimulate and come back to a more healthy range of cognitive function. So cognitive neuroengineering, go to our website and check it out. It's a new field, and UC Davis is really, as you pointed out in your introduction, we had the first Center for Neuroscience. The cognitive neuroscience on this campus is bar none the best in the country. And taking them and combining them with our engineers, it's been a really exciting journey. And we're planning on trying to go to the National Science Foundation and get a Center for Neurotechnology and Science to support this cognitive neuroengineering endeavor.
Awesome. It's very, very exciting. So we have about 3 more minutes, and I want to bring up a topic that I know is near and dear to your heart. So one of the things that strikes me in these centers, and especially in your center, is that you need as much diversity of thought and ambition as possible. Mm-hmm. And so I know that in STEM and in engineering in particular, there hasn't been as much diversity as we'd like to see, and as you might need to really make one of these centers successful. You've been a major proponent for supporting women in engineering, so can you tell us about why that's important to you, and maybe leave us with some words for some of the trainees in the audience about why this is exciting, and you should never have a barrier to getting into a field?
Yeah, so this has been hard in engineering, really hard in engineering. And so we put together an organization we call WINE, Women in Neural Engineering. And it's been for twofold. One is we have a pull, we have a need. And I'm constantly just saddened by seeing these young women come through and working hard to get their degrees and graduate. And then it's not any one thing, it's this death by 1,000 cuts. Little things that happen, we tend to be more family caregivers, we tend to be the one who take the biggest burden for, having and raising children. And when you add up sort of all those little things, it just becomes harder and harder to stay in the neuroengineering field. And I think part of that is because we have this sort of, especially in engineering, this sort of little round circle that says, if you can fit into this little round circle, then you can be a member of neuroengineering. And the reality is this is bad for neuroengineering. It's bad for engineering in general, and it absolutely makes no sense. How could we begin to talk about developing new technologies to help people with neurological injuries and disease when half the people are women and 99% of the people studying this are men? It makes no sense. And then when I'm also continually surprised when I talk to women, and there is this very sad fear of being considered a token. And I'm just want to say to everybody, your contribution is valuable. And I think Dr. Carly said this earlier, go for what you are passionate about. And none of that other stuff matters. And if it has been okay for the last several hundred years for a small segment of society to be in control because it was passed down from generation to generation, that to me is the greatest sense of tokenism I've ever seen. So how can those people who have been in control all this time say, oh, well, somehow I'm not a token and somehow you are a token? It's absurd. So I say to women out there, there's no such thing as tokenism. It does not exist, or it has always existed. And that's it's either one of those two extremes, and there's no in between. So it doesn't matter. You belong here, you're wanted, and you're desperately needed, and you have a contribution to make, and focus on that, and all the rest of it is not important. When you need support, look out and get it. I think this is very important what Dr. DeCarli said. Find a mentor. It's the most important thing. Some People who have power in neuroengineering don't necessarily make the best mentors. So you want to find someone who you think would make a good mentor for you. And you probably need more than one. No one person is probably going to be able to understand all of your dimensions. And each one of those dimensions of who you are, whether it's culturally or gender or just passion about different aspects of science, you'll probably need a bunch of different people. And I think it's smart to say, okay, this is who I am, and I am this multifaceted person, so I'm going to find 3 or 4 mentors and use them in different ways to give me insight into the pieces that I need to create the kind of career that I really want to have.
Terrific. So I know that within the new Center for Neuroengineering and Medicine that Dr. Moxon has lots of really innovative ideas for how to enhance diversity and support all sorts of different kinds of perspectives in this field. And she's really also a dedicated mentor, as is Dr. DeCarli and our next set of speakers. So thank you so much, Dr. Moxon, for everything that you do.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.